So there's this thread that I saw on Twitter that was going around about a couple of weeks ago, and it was a thread about pieces of conventional wrestling wisdom, received wrestling wisdom that people were all supposed to think a common narrative, I suppose, for wrestling opinions on the internet. The thread was by someone called Orby, and it was basically saying, what conventional wisdom narratives have you found to be complete bullshit in your wrestling journey, regardless of where you picked them up, if they were from some sort of WWE endorsed history, whether they were from, pillars of the internet wrestling community, the wrestling intelligentsia, or whatever. And it's quite an interesting thread. A lot of people had their own thoughts on the matter, their own things that they wish to highlight. And what I thought I would do here is go through some of them. I've picked out 15 of these bits of received wrestling wisdom that I wish to talk about, whether I agree or disagree with them. So yes, as I say, there's 20 of these little things here, and I thought I'd share my thoughts on these as we go. So, first one. To be a good wrestler, you have to execute moves cleanly and do a lot of them. So yes, this I guess is the old work rate thing. You have to do a lot of moves in every match and they all have to be absolutely clean. If there's even the slightest imperfection in those moves, then well, that's just not going to do. This is something that I totally disagree with. I kind of find it fun in a match when, especially as a match gets to its later stages, things aren't necessarily executed perfectly, where there is a bit of sloppiness, a bit of emotion taking hold. That to me is the sign of, the match is hurting them, they're selling the match, it's a endurance, it's a battle of wills. Now of course there is a difference between that and something that's quite clearly a botch, but yes, not every move has to be executed, perfectly. And it is also obviously okay if sometimes there's a bit of time between some big moves. I mean, I suppose you could also spin this to being some sort of argument against the AEW style of wrestling. I'm sure some people would. I'm not necessarily thinking about that. But in my opinion, there's rooms for all sorts of wrestling, and I like it sometimes when things do get a bit sloppy, when it does get a bit ragged around the edges. Number 2. A match can't be good if it's shorter than a certain time frame. That's just a complete bullshit bit of received wisdom right there. I mean, that would outlaw so many damn fine sprints that there are in the course of wrestling history. Some excellent 5-10 minute matches that just really that pack a whole lot of punch into a little package. Plus, I mean, I would say in this, putting that in kind of historical context, there are times in wrestling history, I can think of All Japan in like the mid-late 90s, or Noah at some points as well, where every main event match being long, like being 30 minutes or so, could actually be a lot of the times to the detriment of a match, because you would get crowds in those matches who knew that these guys, because it's a big main event match, whether it's a Misawa, Kawada, or any combination of the 4 pillars, they kind of think, well, they're obviously not going to go any shorter than 30 minutes, so for the first half of the match or anything, they just don't really react. And that kind of hurts the match, because you want the crowd to, be engrossed in the action. You want them to be on the edge of their seat, and clearly they're not, because they think, well, they're going to go long anyway, so why should we start reacting until we're like 15 minutes in, or even 20 minutes in, when we're kind of at the point where there's actually a chance of this match finishing. The amount of money something makes determines its quality. If our first one was kind of possibly a more AEW-centric bit of received wisdom, then this one's definitely a WWE-received bit of wisdom. If it makes money, then obviously it's good. I mean, all these people are liking it and whatever. I mean, I've always come across this in, obviously, things like music as well. You look at, like, the top 10, greatest selling albums of all time, and, well, geez, those sold like millions of records. Surely they're all good. You look at the top films of all time and it's like, well, so many people saw this, surely they're all good. I don't know, what's a good example of that? The Passion of the Christ? That made hundreds of millions of dollars. Is that good? I mean, that would be my argument against that. I mean, I'm not sure why wrestling fans sometimes concern themselves so much with the amount of money something makes. Is it because, they want to make sure that lots of people like what they like? They need that sort of confirmation. I don't know, it's something that really, I don't know why people would concern with it. Unless you're on a board of directors, unless you're actually part of the company and, you know, the money that company makes is crucial to you, why would you care so much about the amount of money it makes? I don't know, that's just weird to me. Number 4, All Japan is the best wrestling in the world in the 90s. So yeah, this is kind of one that hits close to home for me. Obviously, this can be quite an All Japan-centric channel. A lot of my videos are on All Japan in the 90s. But I mean, that bit of received wisdom, All Japan is the best wrestling in the world in the 90s. I mean, obviously it's something for me that would be right up there. But I do think sometimes, and as much as it is something that I'm saying here, focusing on All Japan in the 90s, the Kings Road style, maybe at the detriment to other federations that were out there, other companies that were kicking around, because truth was, there was so much good wrestling in the 90s. There was good wrestling coming out of just about everywhere. I mean, maybe not so much WWF and WCW at certain points, but there was so much good wrestling. I mean, it could certainly be argued that All Japan wasn't even the best wrestling in Japan in the 90s when you look at the stuff that All Japan women were doing and the amount of incredible matches there are there. You look at the junior heavyweight stuff, the stuff that Michinoku Pro were doing. In the 90s, there was good wrestling everywhere. Shoot style, the best of ECW, FMW as well, if you're into that sort of thing. Everyone was catered for. New Japan as well. Can't even really forget New Japan in that era. It was a great, great time. So, yeah, All Japan certainly is, for me, obviously, the best wrestling in the world in the 90s. Certainly my favourite, at any rate. But it's certainly not the only wrestling in the 90s, that's far from it. So, shouldn't perhaps focus on All Japan over everything else. Kind of sticking with All Japan, number 5, Mitsuharu Misawa was the best pillar. Oh, this is always a tough one, an argument. Just which pillar was best? Who was best? Misawa, Kobashi, Kawada, or Taue? Misawa often kind of gets that number 1 spot. Is Misawa my own personal favourite pillar? No. Misawa's obviously certainly one of my all-time favourites, but my favourite pillar has always been Toshiaki Kawada. And you'll get some whose favourite pillar is Kenta Kobashi. Hell, you may even get some people whose favourite pillar is Akira Taue, whether they're just being contrarian or not, but we will get to Taue as well later. Misawa is certainly, I think, the best foil for all 3 of those pillars. Certainly when you look at the great matches that Kobashi, Kawada and Taue had, so many of those matches were with Misawa. Misawa, I think, almost compared to those other 3 is, in many ways weirdly considering how on the top he was, almost kind of a blank slate. Kind of with the stoicism that he had, you know, that drive to not show any emotion at all, kind of made him a bit different, especially from the likes of Kobashi and Kawada, who just wore their heart on their sleeve and would clearly be absolutely raging, foaming at the bit, doing everything they possibly could to break that wall down. Taue not so much, but Taue again has a great role as an enforcer, especially in tag bouts. I mean, he is one of the best tag wrestlers of all time. Again, we will get to Taue again later. Whereas, you know, kind of Misawa is that blank slate, in that there's very few people who can't have a good match with Mitsuharu Misawa, except weirdly Stan Hansen at various points. Is Misawa the best pillar? Maybe not. Is Misawa probably the most wide-ranged pillar? Probably yes, but it depends on what your stance is. Is being the wide-ranged means that he's the best? I don't know. It's up to you. Right, number 6. Here's a big one. Inokism was bad. That's always been the massively received thing, whether you've looked in at Dave Meltzer observers, whether you're listening to YouTube videos from guys with British voices. You know, that's often been a thing. Inokism is bad. Hell, in my early videos I've often said the same thing. And there are quite a lot of people on the internet who do quite fervently, quite aggressively resist that narrative of Inokism being bad. They will be like, you know, screw you, Inokism's awesome and what the hell do you think about that? They love the unpredictability, I suppose, of Inokism more than anything else. The feeling that anything could happen, that a match could end for any reason at any time. Even the idea sometimes that somebody like Tadao Yasuda or Bob Sapp could be an IWGP champion. They love that, and they think that that unpredictability is one of the best things about Inokism, as opposed to perhaps the more predictable likes of Noah, where you kind of know if Misawa's going up against someone like a Takashi Morishima and Akitoshi Saito. 990 times out of 1,000 they're going to win. There's not much unpredictability a lot of the time when it comes to something like pro wrestling Noah. So my kind of opinion on this, I mean, I know in videos that I've done in the past, particularly my Brock Lesnar in New Japan thing, I was a bit shitty about Inokism then. My kind of feeling now is, you know, maybe I should give it a bit more of a look, have a little rewind on it and see that thing. Because I mean, I remember back in the day, you know, you would get people who championed Inokism then. There were sites, there were New Japan-centric sites back then. It wasn't all Noah and all Japan that people were talking about. It was that sort of thing as well. There was a crowd for it. And there are some wrestlers who I can think of who, you know, did pretty good in the world of Inokism. I mean, as much as I often take the piss out of Yuji Nagata losing in 8 seconds against Krokop or whatever, he had tons of great matches during that time, and he's another guy we'll get to later. I remember guys like Kazunari Murakami, who just had such an incredible look as a wrestler, like almost like Minoru Suzuki on steroids. Young Shinsuke Nakamura, obviously really, I don't know where he'd be if it weren't for Inokism. Yoshihiro Takayama's New Japan run. When I think about it, clearly there's some good stuff there. Obviously, it's not all good stuff, but then you could say the same about any wrestling promotion. I need to go back and have a little second look, because while my own memories generally of that time, as someone who was very much following Noah and not New Japan, aren't particularly great, maybe I ought to go back. I ought to go back to it with fresh eyes and have a look at the best of Inokism. Happily, there are a lot of accounts out there that will tell you the best of Inokism, so maybe I should do that. Number 7, and this is one I feel particularly strongly about, Giant Baba was bad. I am very happy of when there's anyone who rejects this bit of received wisdom. Giant Baba being bad is one of the most ridiculous bullshit bits of received wisdom that I can think of. You know, just because he's got, no lie, of course, possibly one of the most unconventional looks for any wrestler ever, doesn't mean that this guy could not go, and he could go for most of his career. You know, back in the 60s and 70s, this guy was the biggest star, basically, that Japanese wrestling had to offer. Him and Inoki, basically, there was no one else. And technically, if you go back and watch his matches from then, whether you watch the few matches that were available where he's tagging with Inoki, you watch matches against the Destroyer, against Mil Mascaras and folks like that, you're going to see some beautiful technical work. And to be honest, I mean, I think maybe a lot of it comes from Giant Baba's own decision back in like the mid-late 80s. For him to stop going hard, for him to basically leave the spotlight to a younger generation. Because he could have stayed there, he was popular enough to stay there, but he decided to take that step back. So maybe a lot of the things that people have seen from Baba are the comedy matches. You know, they see the match with Raja Line and they think, oh god, that Raja Line's terrible, but it's not like this guy's any good too. But that stuff's kind of really supposed to be a comedy match, as are the endless bouts against Russia Kimura and all that lot. But even in the times, like late in his career when Baba had to go, when he had to team with Stan Hansen in the Real World Tag Leagues, in those times, Baba, at quite an advanced age with a lot of experience, he could still go. He could go the distance. He could go the 30 minutes in those Real World Tag League matches against the top teams of that era, against the Holy Demon Army, against the Super Generation Army. Those matches are something that people absolutely ought to watch. So yeah, Giant Baba being bad, utter bullshit. Giant Baba is one of the greatest wrestlers in professional wrestling history. That's the truth of it. Number 8, this is always a funny old chestnut. Japanese crowds are quiet and respectful. All I kind of have to say to this one is go and watch Kenta Kobashi and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi versus Doug Furnas and Dan Crawford from 1992. Go and watch that match. Go and watch so many other matches that took place in the Korakuen Hall. Hell, I mean, one of the things that I find hilarious about this is that people could talk about Some people you'll get talking about something like the riot that happened in Sumo Hall when Vader beat Antonio Inoki in 5 minutes, and then at some other point, hell, maybe even in the same video, they'll talk about Japanese crowds being quiet and respectful, as if that's just a received thing, as if they've just said that out of their mouth, not realising that it makes any sense. Why would a crowd that's always so quiet and respectful stage a goddamn frickin' riot over professional wrestling? That banned New Japan and, hell, all other Puro promotions from Sumo Hall for years. Doesn't make any sense. So no, Japanese crowds are not always quiet and respectful. It depends on the type of wrestling a lot of the time. It depends on so many things, but when the wrestling's good, yeah, they're going to be shouting about it. You just need to watch pro res to be dissuaded of that opinion. Number 9, guys like Benoit, Malenko and Angle are the peak of technical wrestling. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of technical wrestling outside WWE, whether you look at the classics of World of Sport, whether you look at shoot style guys, you look at your Volcans and whatever. When you look at those guys, you don't necessarily see how Benoit, Malenko or Angle could be the peak of technical wrestling. But then again, it is also a wholly different style. You know, in WWF, WWE, there are more things to consider generally than just technical wrestling. You know, there's more of the soap opera, the glitz and the glamour. You know, much more so than there is in a match where, I don't know, Volkan goes against Nikolai Zuev or whoever. So there's room for all of that, but as far as like if we're talking about pure technical wrestling and nothing else goes, then no, I couldn't say that Benoit, Malenko and Angle are the peak of technical wrestling. As an aside, there does seem to be a lot of hate, a lot of strays directed the way of Dean Malenko of late. I kind of noticed that in the thread. Dean Malenko does seem to get a bit of a kick in from time to time. I find that interesting. I mean, I've always been a fan of Dean Malenko. I was kind of wondering why that is, why there's a bit of a negative narrative against Malenko. I can kind of think of a couple of reasons. I think one reason is because another bit of received wisdom that I can think of is that when it comes to the Radicals and their debut in WWF, Perry Saturn was seen as like the bonus wrestler. That's a received wisdom narrative. He was the bonus guy. The WWE were interested in Benoit, Guerrero and Malenko, and Saturn just came along for the ride. This is a narrative that's bullshit. WWE were very interested in Saturn. Hell, they might have been interested in Saturn more than the other three, because, well, he was bigger. Like, which is obviously always a big WWE thing. Saturn had the muscle, more so than those other three. So, I don't know why people would necessarily think that was a narrative. Maybe just because Saturn's WWE career didn't necessarily pan out as well as it could have. I think also maybe another reason from it, from more smarter circles, is that people want to put a lot more respect on Joe Malenko's name. Joe Malenko, Dean Malenko's brother, you can often see matches early on in Japan a lot of the time where the Malenko brothers teamed up. Now, I like Dean Malenko a lot. Joe Malenko is also really damn good, and Joe Malenko, perhaps, if you look at his matches, has way more of an aura, in fact, than Dean Malenko does. Joe Malenko just feels like a technical wrestling terminator. He's damn good. Unfortunately, he wasn't really in wrestling for long. He decided to give it up. But yeah, maybe people just want to put a lot more flowers on Joe Malenko, and they want to put flowers on Perry Saturn, and so that's why Dean Malenko gets a bit of a kicking from some quarters. Maybe I'm just spouting a load of bollocks. I don't know. I often am. Number 10. ROH is the best indie promotion of the 2000s. Now this one I kind of think of like the All Japan is the best wrestling world in the 90s one that we covered a few ones ago. ROH for me indeed probably is the best indie promotion of the 2000s, certainly my favourite, but that doesn't mean that people should only watch ROH from that time. I mean sure, their mid to late 2000s peak was incredible, but there were so many other indie companies doing great stuff around that time. You could find good stuff just about anything. They were all releasing DVDs and the like on Smart Mark Video or whatever. CZW, I mean obviously you had the hardcore wrestling, as Jim Cornette always used to say, but there was a lot of great stuff in there too. A lot of great guys working there, guys like Ruckus, Sabian, Eddie Kingston, Chris Hero and Claudio Castagnoli. Same goes for IWA Mid-South. You had events there like the Sweet Science 16, later the Ted Petty Invitational, same as the CZW had with Best of the Best, where you would see Lots of great wrestling, and you would see lots of great matchups in these tournaments that you wouldn't necessarily see at all if you only watched Ring of Honor. I can think of ones like Low-Ki versus Gran Akuma from, I think, 2007 Ted Petty Invitational, I think that was, 07-06. Phenomenal little match. Even seeing, some historical curios like Ricochet back when he had long hair. Historical curios is kind of another big reason why it's always good to explore these old indie promotions, some of which, you can now find their stuff on YouTube, kind of easier to find now than it was back then. Things like a young Kazuchika Okada in the indies in UWA Hardcore, a promotion that in many ways is sadly long forgotten now, but this stuff is available and this stuff is historically important. It was here where, basically, when he faced Jushin Liger in a tag match, kind of the trajectory for his career was set from that. So many other promotions back in those times, PWG were obviously doing good stuff then, as they still do. You've got the eternal weirdness of Chikara, and again you get so many ridiculous combinations there, especially when you get to, the classic King of Trio stuff, and as much as Chikara kind of ended up going down in a big fireball, there's a lot of stuff from that time that I miss. So much good stuff out there in the 2000s that's worth seeking out. Shimmer as well for American Joshi Pro Res. So much that I could just reel off. So yeah, you should, as much as ROH may be the best known indie promotion, and yes, when you consider all their cards and the hideous amount of talent that they had working them, probably the best on balance, I would say. That doesn't mean that you should just check out classic ROH cards and then just stop there. There's a whole world more goodness. Number 11. Bob Backlund was boring. This is something that Meltzer kind of used to come out with back in the day. I don't think he was a particularly big Backlund fan. I think nowadays there are quite a lot of people who appreciate what Bob Backlund brought to the win, and I'm pretty happy for that because I've always liked him. I mean, he is one of naturally the most strongest people ever to be in wrestling, certainly one of the most gifted athletes, and I think he had a lot wider range than people give him credit for. I mean, I've seen Backlund have brilliant matches, obviously his shoot-style bouts that he had against the likes of Takada and Masakatsu Funaki. One thing which I didn't cover in my 5 Foreign Wrestlers in Japan video, which I massively missed out on, was his time in Battle Arts, and this is like in the late 90s when he was obviously getting on a bit, having great matches with people like Yuki Ishikawa, Daisuke Aikida, even the great Sasuke. I'm kicking myself for not covering that. I will have to rectify that in the future. I absolutely loved his Mr. Bob Backlund character. That was one of the highlights of generally a pretty poor time for WWE. That character was great. He was a brilliant heel. I mean, I've always thought that Howdy Doody was superb. So, yeah. I don't know why, he gets dogged on, and he was massively over in that territory back in the time when he was champion. There is no denying that. Number 12, this is kind of another Meltzer one. Akira Taue was lazy. I'm not sure if Dave Meltzer, most of the time, has really had many good words to say about Akira Taue. Always dogged on him, especially when compared to the other pillars. Okay, Taue probably has more bad matches, perhaps on average, than the other pillars, but no, I've always loved Taue. Taue was great. He's one of the greatest tag wrestlers of all time, an absolutely perfect enforcer, and brilliant singles as well. There were times in his career, not all the time, but there were times when he was right up there with the other three. Back in 1995 and 1996, he was phenomenal, and he was good for a long time. I mean, Taue, I think, pretty much was good right up until nearly the finish, when I think of some of the matches he had in later years in Noah, his match against Yuji Nagata. Probably one of my favourite of the Kobashi title defences is the one with Taue. The match that he had with Misawa, where the crowd were so for Akira Taue, like they were even booing Misawa, which is something that you almost never hear. Absolutely love Taue. Can't say I ever agreed with Dave Meltzer when it comes to him always saying, Akira Taue, he's crap, which is essentially what he said. And this is another one I don't think he hears so much anymore. Yuji Nagata was bad. Nagata, I think nowadays, especially because he's had such a long career and he's basically been great throughout all of it, Nowadays, Nagata gets a lot of roses, but yeah, definitely wasn't always the case. I think especially back in the 2000s, on more Noah-centric sites, you'd get people who kind of just thought of Yuji Nagata as, I don't know, a bit of a goof, a bit of a goober. Was it because of all the saluting? Was it because of the whole Crow Cop thing? Him being classed as kind of, I suppose, a victim in many ways of Inokism, even though outside of the Crow Cop thing, he was pretty damn high up in New Japan throughout all of that time. Yeah, he just often always kind of got a bit of the shitty end of the stick, I feel. Not so much anymore. I've always had a lot of love for Nagata. I remember some of the many great matches. I mean, he was certainly back then a ideal champion guy, and whether it was matches against, fellow older surlier gets like Shiro Koshinaka is one I remember him having a particularly great match with back in the mid-late 2000s period, or against younger guys. He just fits every role. A great invader as well. He's done lots of great stuff in other promotions, Noah and all that. He's a spunky bastard. He shows a lot of character, and he can do just about anything. So yeah, nowadays I think Nagata is generally classed as one of the greats, but yeah, not always the case as I remember. John Cena can't wrestle. Yeah, this was always one I remember participating in a lot of flame wars on forums for this back in the 2000s. For a long time, again, Cena always kind of gets his flowers these days. I've been pro Cena. That sounds weird, I've been pro Cena. I've been a fan of Cena's probably since it was 2006 where he really kind of clicked for me. I think at first, perhaps because, I remember his feud with Angle and Bischoff in 2005 kind of been diabolical, and that's kind of when a lot of the boos and that started for him. Not being a big fan of him at first, back in like the beginning of Super Cena times. But 2006 was when he clicked, I think very specifically, the match with Rob Van Dam at One Night Stand, which is an absolute classic. From there, the feud with Edge, the frickin' match, the frickin' feud, and especially the Royal Rumble 2007 match against Umaga, the last man standing. To me, that is one of the greatest matches that has ever occurred in a WWE ring. That match has frickin' everything. An absolutely perfect match. Obviously Umaga for me is another guy who's tremendously underrated, but it's a match where both people just play an absolutely perfect part, one of the most brilliant big man versus superstar matches you're ever likely to find. And from there the list just kind of goes on. Obviously the man can wrestle. So yeah, that's kind of how long I've been on the pro Cena train. For some people it took longer than that, way longer even than that. I think for a lot of people it almost kind of didn't click until like the times when he was feuding against AJ Styles. And that's like over 10 years later, but no, always been a big Cena fan. So yeah, definitely was never part of the Cena booing the "you can't wrestle" chants and all of that. And finally, Sid was bad. A lot of people gave flowers to Sid when he passed away. I think a lot of people realised, or a lot of people were happy to say just how much they always liked him. And yeah, I've always loved Sid. I loved Sid since I was a child. Say what you will about his technical prowess as a wrestler. Yeah, obviously he wasn't technical at all. Say what you will about, the occasional goofy promos, the legendary flubs. I have half the brain that you do. How many people in wrestling had an aura like Sid? Very, very few. He's the classic image of the pro wrestler. When you think of to use a highfalutin term, the platonic ideal of a professional wrestler, who do you think of? It's hard not to think of someone like Sid. He comes off as like that final boss, almost cartoonish in how gloriously imposing he looks. I always loved that about him. Say what you will about the quality of the man's matches, especially if they weren't like jobber squashers or whatever. It did not matter. It didn't matter in WWF, it didn't matter in WCW, it didn't matter anywhere. Sid was amazing, and very sad that he's gone, much missed. So yeah, that about does it for this load of mumbo-jumbo, this load of wrestling received wisdom that's kind of existed over the years, some of which you may be familiar with, some of which you may not be. I suppose it's all stuff that people have picked up, whether it's from Twitter, whether it's from The Observer, whether it's from YouTube videos, or in the case of some lists from me and probably others too if you're a bit more of an older git, from message boards and the like back in the day, from things like Death Valley Driver Video Review or Scott Keith or wherever. All a load of fun. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, whether it's a look back. Hopefully you'll find some things to shout about. I'm sure you probably have your own examples of wrestling received wisdom that you either agree with or disagree with. Maybe you've watched this and you now think that I'm a complete blithering idiot and you're about to say so in those comments down below. Either way, all responses are welcome. Hopefully you've enjoyed, and until the next time, bye for now.